The first thing that I wanted to start talking about was the sculpture of the scribe. Looking at it just from the beginning, it's very impressive how bright the color actually is, considering that this sculpture was actually almost 4,000 years old. So just the value that that color has is very amazing. Another thing that I learned, which I also thought was impressive, was the different materials that this sculpture was actually composed out of. So it wasn't just sculpted out of limestone, it was also had wood included in it, and also on the eyes of the actual sculpture, in order to make them look more open, awake, and lifelike, they were made out of crystals. So just the overall look of the sculpture is something that's very impressive. Another thing that I thought was impressive or interesting about this was the fact that it was actually made for a tomb. So if you look at the sculpture, you'll notice that on the back, it's not as detailed as the front would be, and that's because the sculpture is meant to be facing forward, so placed in the tomb of a pharaoh, something high up, and looking at whatever ceremony or whatever is supposed to be completed. Something that they also talked about in this video was the fact that even though a scribe may seem like something that isn't very high regard, they were actually very, very high up in this culture because they were one of the only people that could read and write. Looking deeper into the history of the Egyptians' art, it was very interesting to see how their art was not only something that was beautiful, but also very functional. So an example of this would be the Palette of Narmer, which was kind of a fancier palette, you could say, because they also had simpler ones that were used for things like mixing like the paint for their eyes and stuff like that. So a palette like this with the very detailed depictions on it would be used for something like a ceremony, like a religious ceremony among that. So that was something that shocked me about the Egyptians' history when it came to their art pieces. The Laco Cave. The first thing that I was really interested to learn about this was the size of the actual cave itself. Originally, I actually talked about one of the pieces that are in this cave, which is the Hall of Bulls. That's something that's depicted on the walls. So whenever I first looked at that, I thought that it was going to be something smaller, or a very small section, but then looking more into it, you realize how large the cave actually is and how both the walls are just covered from the top to bottom with all of these different depictions, mainly animals, which is something that I also thought was interesting because I guess that was just their muse or what they used. So the size of it was something that really impressed me. Another thing was the actual, like the way that they did these pieces, stuff like that, all in limestone. And the ingenuity of the artists, because there was actually stone lamps that were found inside the cave as well, which shows that these artists were working with the light in order to see. And like I said, the advancement of the artists. Something else was the amount of paintings actually found inside of this cave. Like I said, the cave was very large, and there was actually about 600 of these paintings found. And out of all these 600, another thing was the fact that there was actually only one painting or depiction called The Bird-Headed Man with Bison that actually depicted a story of something happening instead of these just kind of small random depictions of the animals and stuff like that. Something else that I thought was interesting with the history of the Egyptians was the symbolism that came with a lot of things that they did. So I thought a good example of this was the way that the pyramids were actually built, the shape that they were built in. It wasn't just because they wanted this triangular shape, but because they actually used that shape as a stepping stone for the pharaohs and the kings that were buried in these tombs, to be able to climb into the sky, into their afterlife.